Great. Well, thank you so much. Welcome to everybody this morning, and thank you for being here with us today to celebrate International SEL Day. Your attendance here today, I think, really attests to our shared belief in the importance of SEL. I think while that's always been true, and the impact and importance to our K-12 community has always been true, the events of the past year have only accelerated the urgency and the broad-based understanding of the importance to this. As we look forward at the coming year, the priority perhaps hasn't changed, but a lot of questions remain around precisely how do we do this now that we are bonded as a community in this need, hopefully in some accelerated funding, some accelerated movement on the part of the industry in total. It leaves us with a lot of questions around how we're going to make this happen, how we're going to train our teachers, how we're going to incorporate this. And so it's very exciting today to have assembled this august panel to help address some of these questions and as a team and as a community begin to have a deeper conversation about this. We're deeply honored to have this group of panelists together with us today and to have all of you as attendees to join in this really important conversation and beginning to build a shared vision around how we're going to build these protective factors for all of our youth of today and our leaders of tomorrow. From a Nasco Education perspective, I'm deeply appreciative of Cloud9 World and the partnership to bring to our community a better solution to assist this creation of strong, empathetic, successful students for the future and to better serve our teachers. We recognize that this all starts at the point of the spear with the teachers in the classroom delivering this to our youth. So on our panel today, I want to just do a quick introduction of who's on the panel, and then we'll allow each of them to introduce themselves more fully. But our moderator today will be Dr. Michael Hyland with Cloud9 World. Thank you so much. We also are honored to have Pat Connor. Pat, thank you for being with us today. And Pat is a consultant with Castle. And then on the front lines, we have Kimberly Young from Broward County Public Schools in Florida. Thank you so much for being here. Dr. Philip Brown, who's with the National School Climate Center, will also be participating in our panel. Thank you, Philip. And Sean Slate, the UNESCO Chair on Global Health and Education. So a wonderful group of folks who'll give you a little bit more insight into their backgrounds and perspectives here in just a second. If I could just do a second of general housekeeping for our attendees, you'll see a question box. Please, at any time, insert any questions there. Michael will be moderating those. We will get to absolutely as many questions as we can during this time. I recognize you're all on listen-only mode, so please do put your questions in there so that the panel can address them. At the completion of the webinar today, you will receive a certificate of completion as well as a recording, and we'll get those out within about an hour of the finish of today's webinar so that you have it for reference. And then you'll also see in the box to the right-hand side some handouts listed there for your reference with some more details on today's content and solutions. And so please do take advantage and download those for your future use and reference. I shared with the panel in the moments before all of the attendees came on that I am deeply humbled at the expertise and knowledge. So humbled, in fact, that my goal was to get off as quickly as possible and let you talk to the people who have the real experience, knowledge, and content to add to this body of knowledge today. And so with that, I'm really just going to turn it over to Michael. And maybe, Michael, if you would start with your introduction and then let each of our panelists share a little bit more about themselves with our attendees. Thank you.
Okay, well, it's an honor to be here. I am Dr. Michael Hyland. I am actually, I consult with Cloud9. I am actually coordinator of doctoral studies at Southern Wesleyan University in South Carolina, where If you wonder where that is, I look that way and there's Clemson University. So in the upstate of South Carolina. My background, I'm retired out of administration and alternative education. So that's when I got into social emotional learning. And I've worked on the National Alternative Education Association and the board of directors there, and know Pat from that. So, but I'm looking forward to hearing from the other panelists. Studies show that SEL provides many benefits to students, from improved social emotional skills, well-being, and behavior, to improved academic outcomes. Even some studies showed in the long term up to 18 years later. So I'm really looking forward to what this panel has to share, and specifically their background, what they bring for you to hear. So enough from me. My first question, actually, I'm going to reach out to you, Sean, okay? So I'll have you introduce yourself. I know you've been in education for over 3 decades, or working with education for over 3 decades, and during that time, you've probably observed the need for SEL instruction has grown significantly, I'm guessing. Or is it just that it hasn't gotten as much attention in the past? What are your thoughts on this current events in social emotional learning?
Great, thank you very much, Michael. And I'll do a very, very brief introduction, then jump into your question. So yeah, I'm Sean Slate. I've been in education for over 3 decades. I'm a co-founder, as was mentioned, of the UNESCO Chair on Global Health and Education, which really looks at the combination and the alignment of health and education in our schools. I'm also an NBC SEL expert, and for the last decade, most people have known me for leading the whole child work at ASCD, which is really seems to be picking up and becoming mainstream. The question's a good one, and I actually think it's both. I think we've seen a decrease over the last couple of decades of schools being able to focus on the social emotional aspects of education. And that's because we've seen this rise in focusing on academics and content delivery. And so as teachers have gotten less time in the school and less time in the classroom, we've unfortunately seen the ability to focus on the social emotional aspects of learning decrease. And then what's happened more recently is we've actually come to understand that social emotional learning is part and parcel of effective teaching and learning. And so as we've focused more on academics and seen a decrease in social emotional learning, now we're seeing a flip in understanding that social emotional learning, getting that positive school climate, is critical, is fundamental to effective teaching and learning. We talked about the protective factors in the introduction, and we all know that when you feel cared for, when you believe that what you're learning is meaningful, when people around you expect you to achieve high things, then you start to perform better. The environments that we create are critical. We've also seen over the last year in COVID, and there aren't many positives that have come out of the last academic school year, but one of the positives that I've seen in the work is that there's been almost a re-understanding of the benefit and the power of students' sense of belonging, sense of connectedness, and well-being being critical. So it was actually really reassuring when schools reopened, whether it was hybrid or remote or even face-to-face through this year, how most schools were focusing on making sure their students felt like they belonged. That was the most important thing. And so I think what COVID has probably done as well is reframed our understanding about what's important in education. And whether it's parents or whether it's principals or whether it's teachers or whether it's students themselves, it's been a re-understanding that well-being, connectedness, belonging are just critical to teaching and learning for our students.
Thank you. I really appreciate that and your sharing. Pat, I'm going to turn to you because you too have been in education for over 30 years. I don't want everyone to think out there we're all old people, but we've just got started young. And so But how would you say your observations are regarding that? What has been your experiences working, especially through Castle, where I know it's growing?
Right. So do you want me to tell a little
I'm
bit
sorry,
about
a little bit about you.
Okay. To kind of frame my experience, I'm Pat Connor, and I am a senior policy, so that's old, senior policy and practice consultant with Castle. I've been in that position for about 1.5 years. And prior to that, I was fortunate to be the executive director of the Office of Student Supports for the Department of Education in Tennessee. And then before that, I stayed there for 7 years. And then before that, I was in a school district for 27 years. And all my experience has been about school climate and culture, social emotional learning, at promise programming for students, trauma-informed care. So I have, because I am senior, I do have a lot of experience in those. And Sean, I hear what you're saying. I think now, because of the recent situation we find ourselves in this country with COVID and social injustices, social emotional learning has been hyper focused on right now. And we don't want schools to be overwhelmed by that, because social emotional learning is universal. It's good for all students, and it's good for all adults. And I just want to reiterate the adult piece. What I say in the trauma work I do, this work's not about the kids as much as it's about the adults who are doing the work. So about that self-care. So I think now that they're making their reopening plans, and Castle has done a lot of work. If you go on castle.org, you'll see our SEL roadmap to reopen schools. But it's all about how we can elevate social emotional learning as we transition back to full reopening or hybrid. And you can do SEL in hybrid, absolutely. So I don't know, did that answer your question, Michael?
Yeah, it did. And I appreciate you bringing in the hybrid and the virtual component of it, because I know I've been asked recently to do some research on that very issue. So I'm going to turn to Dr. Brown. Philip, okay, I'm going to have you introduce yourself a little bit, because you're another one with over 3 decades of experience. So I won't talk about any ages here, but you've been working from a different perspective. Greatly with those who impact the young children, administrators and teachers. Okay, what would you say are effective means in helping teachers and school leaders grow in understanding of the importance of social emotional learning for themselves and in helping their students? Maybe professional development per se, or something along those lines.
Thanks, Michael. And it's been good to be with all of you and the viewers, listeners as well. I spent my career as an inveterate outsider, kind of working my way into schools, first from the drug and alcohol prevention side with the state drug and alcohol agency in Pennsylvania, and then they got tired of me in Pennsylvania, so I moved over to New Jersey and spent many years in the State Department of Education in the student support area. Found my way to Rutgers, where I did research, U.S. Department of Education research in social emotional learning programs, and was fortunate enough to create a network that created a professional development center. And a lot of what I learned, I always tell teachers and administrators, everything I learned from watching them and listening and learning how to be a good partner. More recently, I've been coaching people in a certificate program with the National School Climate Center, and that's been really illuminating, because it's given me kind of multi-year professional development opportunities with already seasoned educators. So I've learned a lot from them as well. I think, to get to your question, Michael, that leadership, I think, is absolutely key, both in choosing and implementing SEL programs. If they're going to be effective, administrators, teacher leaders, parents, and students all need to be involved and informed as those choices are made. the danger right now that SEL is beginning to be successful in a way that can easily become another educational fad. Educators are in America are really prone to kind of fadism, I think, or the newest thing that's going to make our lives easier and our students smarter. But if you're going to have a pro-social oriented school, you have to be intentional, strategic, and collaborative, I think, in how you embrace SEL and what does it really mean. That means asking a bunch of critical questions, I think, as we reflect on how we engage in this effort. Questions such as, does everyone agree that this is both urgent and important work? We have to be persuasive in that regard, not just say this is the new flavor of the month or the year. Who's been involved in the decision making? Has there been adequate initial and ongoing professional development support? All too often, we bring programs into schools and don't give teachers the adequate support to really implement with fidelity. Is there a team involved? Has the team visited another school that has been successful in implementing high quality SEL? That's one of the strategies that I found most effective, is putting educators in touch with one another when they found somebody who they can really relate to who's successful. Is there a built-in evaluation process so we know how well we're doing? Are we asking everybody, all who's affected, about the notion of that implementation is never free of problems? And another strategy and structure that I've found can be really transformative is authentic professional learning communities. If you have authentic professional learning communities, you have a structure in place that you can use to answer all those questions that I've run through. And I think that's also an important part of making sure that there's real integrity in the process.
Thank you, Philip. I appreciate that. And I really like that you bring about the idea of intentional and collaborative.
Mhm.
I remember at my last school where I was a principal, high school principal in an alternative school, PLCs, of course, professional learning communities were big, and they were really discipline focused, math, English, whatever. And I said at my school, we're going to actually create one around social emotional learning so that we have it embedded within the school. At first, everyone looked at me like I was crazy, but then it became one of the more popular ones to serve on, so I appreciate that. Now we turn to the youth of the group. Okay, so Kimberly smiles, she knows who that is. Kimberly, you're still in the trenches there and in the schools. In your current position, I know you've been doing a lot of work in areas of climate and school discipline. And I know your district is heavily invested in social emotional growth of your students. What trends are you seeing regarding SEL instruction initiatives in your school specifically, and how are they playing out?
Thank you for having me here today. I appreciate it. So I do work for Broward County Public Schools in the Department of School Climate and Discipline. I've spent 13 years teaching middle school. And as an educator in the classroom, I had the ability to teach social emotional learning before I even knew what it really was. And the impact that I made with the students and the growth that I saw with my students was absolutely amazing. So when I was introduced to SEL, I was like, this is something I've already been doing. So it's one of those things that just for me is very natural. With our district, with social emotional learning, we have a whole division now for social emotional learning. So we have been collaborating, building professional developments, working with CASEL, looking at different curriculums that we can bring into the schools. And what we're seeing is the impact of that, building those relationships. And I like what Pat said about the teachers, right? It's that self-care of our teachers. So in Broward, we really are focusing on that teacher self-care so that we can start building into the students and building on that social emotional learning for all students across our district. Our lower socioeconomics areas, we've built in mindfulness even as a big part of our SEL components, and that's a required now. So every day students are starting with mindfulness. So we're teaching it early, and we're encouraging not only the students but also the staff members to be a part of that mindfulness building and structure around social emotional learning. as well as the explicit instruction. And how does that look and what does that look like? We realize that we can use prevention materials to teach some of our social emotional skills, and as well as explicit instruction materials from different curriculums that we found.
Okay, thank you. A question popped up that I'm going to interject here from a guest because it fits. How long does it typically take to start seeing any results or changes in the culture of the schools? Have you noticed that? I'm going to stay with Kim on this one.
So it's actually a good question. It's a slow process. I wish to say it was like, wow, today it's there, right? But it's definitely a slow process. I've been working with the social emotional learning in our district now for about 5 years. And those schools that really started strong, you can see it after about 3 to 4 years. And that school climate really starting to change around SEL and the onus of building around that. So for us, it's been about 3 to 5 years.
Okay, very good. Thank you. I'm going to jump over to Pat before I go back to Sean. So Pat, I'm going to stay on that question with you because with Castle, what do they have framework for how long they might expect to see for this to impact and where it might impact?
Well, and that's a great question as well. Castle does, I mean, it's very much depends on the school and the school that this is being implemented in. What we do know, and with what Castle has developed, are frameworks. They have a district-wide guide and a school-wide guide about the implementation of SEL. And it needs to be SEL that's not only equity-focused, but systemic as well. So this SEL should be integrated, embedded in everything you do. And I know Kim is familiar with, there are 10 instructional practices that teachers can engage in and learn to promote social emotional learning within their classroom, as well as Castle has the 3 signature practices, which are your optimistic, your optimistic welcome, and your working piece, and then your closure. And so those are practices that can be a part of a school climate and culture, and that are just, this is how we do business every day. And to me, for sustainability purposes, that works better in a school because SEL doesn't have to cost anything. And that's what I like about SEL.
I think I'm glad you brought that up because for some people overemphasize that, we can't afford to do it,
Yeah.
It can be. And in a book I'm going to shamelessly plug, I just got a book published that it's about that idea of what you can just do in the schools. Mm-hmm. Sean, Philip mentioned parents, and all of a sudden my questionnaire started lighting up about parents. Okay, I'm going to come to Philip afterwards, but I'm going to have Sean answer this one from his perspective he brings. The questions are, how big of a role should the parents play, or how much collaboration should there be with parents, community agencies regarding and prioritizing SEL, if that makes sense, the question.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. And we've always found that the more integration there is between the school and the parents and the school and the community, the more that we're promoting and teaching the same things. And so the more that it can flow both across classrooms and across the whole school, but also into the whole community, the more you're getting it reinforced all of the time. And what's been really interesting is, 2 things. So much of my work sort of goes out into sort of the global aspect. And so seeing what's happening over in Europe or across the Americas or in Australia as well. And what we're seeing is a lot more schools are understanding that learning takes place not only in the classroom and not only in the school between 8:30 and 3:30, but it extends into and across the whole day and across the community. And so the more that we're getting these kind of interactions and elements reinforced outside of the standard school day, the better it is for what the students are learning. And then the second thing is, when you start to look at everything that's coming out from the future of schooling and where education is heading, we are moving away from being confined around these defined subject areas. Not to say that they won't still be important, but we're moving away from talking about education is only about language arts and only about math or physics or geography. And we're moving into realms when we're talking more and more about the need for students to be collaborative, problem solvers, empathetic citizens, team players. And these are all things that flow directly into social emotional learning. So we're morphing into this understanding of social emotional learning is not only a great foundation and basis for teaching and learning, these are also the skills that our students and our teachers as well are going to need to master moving through this century as well. So they're both the skills and they're also the platform.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And Philip, I know you've, of course, you mentioned this and broached this project topic. Anything to expound on that a little bit more, either from an administrator's perspective or leadership perspective?
Well, clearly, if you're going to have a school that is truly a community school, that is, that it relates to the community, you need to have parents really involved and in more than just a token way. You know, it used to be that a PTA felt like it was doing its job if it raised money for some extra pencils and bags for kids. And the schools that I have most respect for and have learned from, where they understand that it's a culture that is being brought to bear rather than just things and items to support the school. It's where parents really feel like they have a place at the table on a regular basis at both the district and the individual school level. And that means if you have, which we recommend, a school climate team, whatever that team may be called, that there's a parent involved, at least one or two, and that you have a way to reach out to other parents, because our schools are filled with kids with all sorts of kinds of needs, and parents that come to us with all sorts of backgrounds, ethnicities and cultures and so forth. So they need to feel comfortable in the school environment, and that it's not an intimidating place for them to be able to have their voices heard. And I think that's opening that door, rather than waiting for an issue or a problem for the parent to come to the school, is absolutely critical. So it's that continual sense that there are multiple ways of involving parents. And a good practical example of this, I'll kind of use the question as a way of mentioning this, is service learning. Service learning is a really interesting modality because it involves the curriculum, and as Sean was saying, it takes real problems in the school and the community, gives kids, teachers, and the community a sense of we can do something together to solve problems. We can identify what a meaningful problem and work on it together. When that happens, you get all of a sudden a true community school where everyone sees that this is a fulcrum, not just for individual learning, but for building a pro-social culture.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate you incorporating the service learning, and to highlight that, I just want to share, service learning is different than community service. I want to point that out to people who get that mixed up and say, oh, we're doing service learning, we went out and raked an old lady's yard. While that's an important thing to do, service learning is tied to the curriculum, as Philip mentioned. So that's the key to that. I'm going to try to, Chris has a question here, and I'm going to try to ask it. It's for Kimberly, okay, about Broward. Is the mindfulness instruction K-12? And then he has a question mark about the 10 instructional practices.
Yes, the mindfulness is K through 12, and every teacher has been given multiple resources to use. We find that the elementary schools tend to use a lot of the programs like Go Noodle to do some sort of, mindfulness activities. We also use Inner Explorer as another one of our mindfulness resources for the schools. And a lot of the teachers like the Calm app that's out there, that they can just play some sort of mindfulness recording for the students to follow.
Right, thank you. This next question, I want to say is pestilence. I can say that because I recognize the last name. Apparently my sister registered for this event. Okay, and she works in international education. So this one's going to be open to the panel. Sean, you may have come up as part of what you shared, but it's she's new to the concept of SEL. She works in international education, more recently study abroad. Is there a role for social learning in study abroad programs, or is it too individually focused or transient? You know, the question I think is relevant to the topic because we need to look at it from a bigger framework. But I'm going to pose that one for anyone who's willing to answer that.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in to start with. I basically see social emotional learning as being a foundation for effective teaching and learning, and I don't see the two things being separate. And so whether the school is international or whether it's in Arlington, Virginia, or whether it's in anywhere across the US, making a positive school climate and a positive relations with your students and making them feel connected is part and parcel of effective teaching and learning. I would almost say that it's probably more necessary when you start to get into the international schools because you're actually looking at so many students from different cultures. You're trying to absorb different cultures. You're trying to align different cultures, different languages. And so developing things around student voice and agency and empathy and cultural understanding and respect really, you know, I taught in international schools for most of the 90s as well. And I really expounding on that process of understanding not only where the school is situated, but also where the students and the staff are coming from. It's really a great learning experience. So I definitely would say it's part and parcel of international schools, but it's also part and parcel of any K-12 school anywhere in the world.
Thank you. Any others before I move on to Pat with this next question?
Well, I would just add that I've been working for a number of years with a school in Southwest China. And the reason, this is a private after-school SEL program. And they've been able to make it a business because middle and upper middle class parents in China, as you were talking about earlier, Michael and Sean as well, they understand what the skill sets are that they want their children to have if they're going to be successful. And the Chinese rigid traditionalist system is not offering those skills to their kids. So they're willing to pay extra to get some of those skills after school and on the weekends. And in the process, they're seeing that it's beginning to transform their own parenting skills. So it's transformative, not just for potentially for students and teachers, but also for parents.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Philip. And I will say, from my perspective, a couple of summers ago, I got to take a team of teachers because I teach those who want to be teachers, pre-service teachers, to China to work at a camp where parents paid for extra because to make sure they got skills that were not necessarily supported. Although the Chinese government did support the camp, they called it. So I appreciate that. Pat, the question that came up says this: what practices are ideal for one-on-one tools for students who struggle emotionally, especially teens, given the high rates of suicide or suicide attempts?
So supports for what we would say in education are tier 2 or tier 3 students, and which is very interesting. And I just want to say a little bit about that. I'm currently involved in a community of practice with states, and state government is who departments of ed are who I primarily work with. But to look at how you can embed social emotional learning skills within tier 2 and tier 3, and not just having it as a universal practice, which it is, but what we know is those skills that you need to have to address mental wellness are those same skills that you use across the board. Learning how to manage your emotions, learning decisions, getting along with other folks, developing relationships. Those skills can be taught within Tier 2 and Tier 3. SEL is not a symptom or the lack of a symptom of mental illness. It is a competence that can be taught that will help students and adults address their mental health issues. And so some strategies do a lot with, when I was in the district, we had programs called care teams, and those were for students at Promise who were struggling with their own social development in school. And we would have strategies within those groups and that focused a lot on emotions. One simple strategy that takes no time is we would have all the emotion cards on the floor in little 3x5 index cards. And so as the students, high school students came in, they were to pick that emotion that they were feeling that day. And then that's how the opening ritual was, to talk about the emotion that you had that day and to process that and to look at why you were feeling that. How could you have done that differently? So I think those kinds of strategies at Tier 2 and Tier 3, and with RTI, response to intervention, Tier 2 teachers can really lead students into looking at why they arrived at that, why are they struggling with that particular subject, what could they do to improve their study, and it's all really related around social emotional skills, learning those skills and having that knowledge to apply them in the correct situations. So, and as I mentioned, there were 10 teaching practices, there are 4 social practices and 6 instructional practices. And all of those practices can be utilized in Tier 2 and Tier 3 to some extent as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Appreciate that, Pat. Philip, I'm going to extend on that question to you because I worked in a background with alternative school students who struggled emotionally. And the question I have here is extended on that. In your work with ICAP, have you been able to determine a correlation between a person's emotional intelligence, because that's how I say social emotional learning is about growing emotional intelligence, Daniel Goleman, and assault prevention? A connection there, because I think of something that comes to mind when I was a principal.
Do you want to share the case that you're thinking about? Maybe that'll give me a good handle.
Sure. In my case, we had a student who struggled when he got angry, and his natural reaction was to punch. So he punched. Usually, it started initially. He came to the school because he liked to punch others' faces. And then we worked on getting him to stop punching others' faces, but he still punched the wall. And there's this process of dealing with his anger. What we found is he had not found positive ways to express his anger. So we had to grow him emotionally intelligent in understanding his feelings and how to respond appropriately to them. And so we eventually got him to stop punching things. But punching people is, okay, look, I'm not punching people anymore, I'm punching the wall, but he was breaking his hand, breaking things. So that comes to mind. Is that just a unique case I had, or do you think there's correlations in other areas like this?
Sure. I mean, the core response for me in my experience with schools is that obviously there are going to be some kids that are Tier 3 kids, as Pat talked about, who need significant individual attention. And that having been said, the success for that child in a school setting with that help still needs to be embedded in a culture where there are norms that are supported by everybody in the school. And those norms include, you talked about respect, responsibility. We talked a little bit earlier about the sense of belonging is critically important, so that that successful strategies such as restorative practices are built on a sense of how do you take an environment and have everyone believe that their contribution is essential for being able to manage those emotions. And so the key here, I think, is that that you have to turn the switch so people believe that we really are in this together, and that my contribution is recognized, that I'm valued and seen. Often kids react because they don't really have an identity that's being nurtured by the school, and so they form another identity, and that identity it can be destructive or positive. If you have a toxic school culture, it essentially invites or even reinforces those kinds of behaviors. And that's why I think, you know, I sometimes say that culture trumps skills in many respects. That is, we really need to have that culture to be able to furnish the nurturing basis for those skills, and then you have a real chance of being able to deal effectively when kids have special needs. And we've seen this in school. I have a principal who I love who invites special needs classrooms from the district, because he has a way of having those kids their kids present nurture the other kids. So the kids who have normal neuro profiles understand that they can grow in their relationship with these kids with special needs.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I appreciate you talking about culture, because that can be a challenge too. And I'm not going to go with this question here, but for this student, particularly when we talked about culture and client, he said, well, that was the culture of his environment where he grew up, his way. Mm-hmm. So this next question that popped up, I really like from Andrew Lamato. And I'm not sure who to direct it at, so you can think about it and decide whether you want to jump in. It's about integrating the arts and social emotional learning can be overwhelming and exciting at the same time. I will say one of the very first alternative schools I ever visited, art was a requirement of being in the school. It was a charter school, and they required art. I knew that my students would be engaged in this learning, but I don't know where to start without feeling like it would have to, he'd have to work twice as hard to create innovative lessons. Any thoughts or advice about simplifying, incorporating SEL into the arts?
I can give an example. Okay. I worked with a group in Vermont in a school district who wrote and integrated their own social emotional learning competencies with every aspect of their school district, and that school district had 5 schools. And so one of the projects that their art teacher did was to create a mural for their school, and it was on the outside of the school, but there was a focus on social emotional learning in there, taking into perspective their native culture, which is indigenous to that area, taking into consideration person's race and identity. And the kids they let the kids, and this is elementary, do the artwork themselves, and they did a fabulous job. But their focus was on their community, on their school, on each other, and it helped to really build those connections and help to really reinforce the importance of a safe and supportive and just school climate within that building.
Excellent. Thank you.
Can I jump on there a little bit as well to add on to that? Because I think many people assume that you're either doing subjects and content and academics, or you're doing social emotional learning, and they're not sure how to combine these two. It very often comes down to just an understanding and a mindset of why you're teaching and who you're teaching. So you're teaching children and youth, you're not teaching necessarily content. And it also comes down to the questions that you're asking. So you don't often need to even change the process or the format of the school or the scheduling. It's just understanding why you're teaching something. When you teach the arts, whether it's visual arts or whether it's drama or whether it's music, you are naturally having the person look inside themselves, understand how they as a person correspond to whatever production or whatever outlet is being produced. So visual arts is very much a introspective activity which draws out the social and the emotional. Language arts, when you start to look at poetry or literature, yes, you're looking at things in terms of the way the sentence structure evolves and the grammar, excuse me, and the rest of the mechanics around it. But the reason that we study poetry and literature and the classics is we are putting ourselves into the shoes of somebody else. We are trying to understand their perspective. That is an empathetic activity. That is we are learning how others may feel and putting ourselves into that situation via literature or via poetry in a very safe environment, so we don't have to go through that experience ourselves, but we can still understand how that person feels and reacts. So I just want people to, my sort of main point is we don't have to think of these two things as separate, and very often it's the questions that we ask and the questions that we direct to our learners that actually draws out the meaning through those same activities.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I appreciate you bringing in the phrase empathy. That's very important to understand in work with social emotional learning in place of sympathy here. And I would argue, how that works, but I want to get to the next question here. And Kimberly, I'm going to present this one for you because I don't know if you face this issue, but I've talked with principals before, or even in our pre-service teachers who have ideas in the classroom, and they say, the principals say, we don't have time for that. Now, Sean somewhat answered that in his with the idea that it's blended, but what I'm going to ask you specifically is, what would you say? What would you share with a principal or a teacher who says, I don't have time for this, beyond maybe some of the ideas that Sean says they're integrated?
Thank you for the question. Sean actually answered most of that for me, but and it's funny that he said that, because we did, when we started pushing out and training out SEL, that was one of our big things that we were talking to the teachers about, is that it's not just a brand new thing, right? How do we integrate it into the current content that we're already teaching and building on those competencies? I love what Pat said about the service learning project at the school with the art project, right? It's doing those little self-awareness. So building in that character analysis and comparing themselves to that character, doing a portrait of themselves and coming up with those the words. When we started this, we went into the schools and we were looking to see how they were implementing social emotional learning into the classroom. And I remember sitting with a principal and they gave me a teacher's lesson plan for the day. And he's like, she doesn't have time. And I looked at the lesson plan and I found like 4 different activities that she had done. And I was like, all she had to do was one extra step, like Sean said, is build in those questions to start building out the self-awareness, the social awareness conversations around those topics. The beginning of our school year, that first month that we spend in the classroom, it should all be all around that social emotional learning, right? How do we build that self-awareness, build those relationships with our students, get to know one another? And if you start that foundation at the beginning of the year, I find that it just kind of flows itself throughout the school year as well.
Excellent. Thank you. So I'm going to build on that because the question came in about types of professional development that you think that, and Philip, this actually is question specific to you. I'd asked for Dr. Brown on it. that educators need to most successfully plan social emotional within, their social emotional learning activities within their support of students, or if that makes sense, what they're looking for, what type of professional development really would you provide?
Well, I think there are a couple important notes here. The first important thing is what I alluded to earlier, is that compared to other successful countries that do this kind of work, we don't allocate enough time for professional development. And there is a resource question there. So it's not, time is money, and administrators understand that. So we have to get away from the notion that, just because you've got your teaching degree and been teaching for a few years, you can do anything I throw at you. We wouldn't expect a general practitioner in medicine to be a surgeon. And sometimes we ask teachers to do that. So I think that attitude is really important. And then the sense that that we're in this together, so that teachers need to be professional development, so that teachers learn to help each other, which is why professional learning communities are so important, I think, because it enables teachers to honestly talk to each other about the craft. So this sense of that it's a craft, and that we all have strengths and weaknesses, and that we can support each other. So an environment where that support is encouraged and nurtured by administration is critically important. And then, of course, you need to have expertise available and help when you need it. So one of my favorite social emotional learning programs doesn't just sell their curriculum. That is, you can't get the curriculum without professional development. So I think that sends a signal right away. It's like, this is not something that you're going to pick up in a few hours on your weekend. So those are all, I think, to me, the most critical aspects of having it. And then I think earlier I mentioned school to school professional development. We found that to be, people dig into stuff really quickly when they're talking craft, and where it's another school, there's a little bit less defensiveness about what's going on in my classroom, and that can help as well.
Thank you.
So Michael, can I just put in a word for states? If whatever state that you are from, states typically have SEL online modules for teachers, for community members, for anyone interested that's on learning management systems, their platforms. Sometimes they do micro-credentialing where you can earn a credit or have your license renewed if you participate. So I would really look at what your state offers with that, because these are free. There's no charge for those. And I would say, oh gosh, about 40 of our states across the country are really focusing on developing those types of modules for teachers.
And they would just go to the Department of Education webpage for that information, Pat?
Yes, and I would just put in social emotional learning or student supports, and those will pop up, or should. Sometimes you have to really navigate.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I understand. Thank you. So this next question is an interesting one, and I appreciate Katie asking it. How do you get non-believers on board, people who just are not supportive? I remember one day at a faculty meeting I was leading as a principal, and my teacher was like, well, why do we have to teach this stuff? I don't know why we have to, okay? The naysayers that go about and complain that, well, we have to do this with professional development, or we don't understand what they're going through. How do you develop a positive environment around the need to do this? Create a sense of urgency, I guess. I don't have anyone specific to that, so I'm going to just see who's brave enough to step up and answer that one.
Well, let me just say a quick, there are certain political factions in my home state that were totally, and still are, opposed to even saying the word social emotional learning, and wanting no affiliation with that whatsoever. However, at the time, my commissioner really was a believer and felt we needed to do that work. So you just need to be cognizant of what the environment is in your school. And again, you said it perfectly, Michael. Social emotional learning is not an add-on to a teacher's already busy agenda. It's the plate. It's the plate upon which all programs and practices need to come from. So, and it really, I think the mentoring thing is the best way. So I don't do this well, I don't like it. Well, I'm going to put you in a room with a teacher that's doing a great job. I just want you to look at that. And so those are my thoughts about that.
Okay. Sean, did I see you look like you were going to respond?
Yeah, for better or for worse, I always have something to say. It really, from my perspective, it just comes down to mindset, and it comes down to the school leaders asking and posing questions of staff about, what are you trying to achieve through your lessons? What are you trying to achieve this year? I've even done in the last couple of years at some presentations, I asked people, describe the child when they reach 25 and what are their attributes. And what's been remarkable is no matter where I go and who I speak to, whether it's parents or community members or principals or superintendents, the answers are 99% always the same. They always say happy, healthy, empathetic, citizen, resourceful, team player, collaborative. No one ever mentions able to pass year 8 algebra, or no one ever mentions, proficient at language arts. Those are stepping stones. And so I think it's asking those bigger questions about what are we trying to achieve. I think it's important for the school leaders to ask and pose those questions, because I think it was both Pat and Phil mentioned previously, the climate and the culture of the school does come down from the top. And so it's harder to raise it up from the bottom. It can be done, but it does come down from the top. So if you get these questions posed by the school principal or the superintendent, it does start to trickle down. And then, as someone else mentioned, making sure that the leaders themselves are taking social emotional learning seriously for themselves and not just the students is also a wonderful way to start it.
For the sake of time, there are 2 questions left. One has been answered by a registrant. I'm actually going to answer that one, if you don't mind. While I'm not a panelist per se, but it says in the same tune, how do we address schools that believe SEL should be taught at home only? And that example I gave, Adriana, about why do we have to teach this stuff, the guy actually said, shouldn't it be taught in the home? To which all I had to do was pick a handful of students and show the things that they do that are problem behaviors per se that were taught in the home. I think what you do is just, in this case, is exemplify that we're not replacing what the home is doing, we're expanding on it. Some cases we do want to replace, like the gentleman who punched, that was learned at home. His parents, when you're angry, you make someone pay for it. So you want to use opportunities where you can give examples where we are doing this. We don't realize if you're working with problem behaviors, you're doing it. Now, if your school only has a code of conduct that says someone's caught smoking, suspend them for 3 days, and that's going to solve the problem, well, then you're not doing social emotional learning, okay? That's just beating somebody into submission. But what you want to do is present it in a way that we're trying to help students grow emotionally intelligent. The thing we have to understand that some of the challenges we face as a country in terms of later life, high divorce rates and stuff, some of these challenges occur from emotional intimacy. We are not able to develop emotional intimacy as adults because of the lack of emotional intelligence growth we had growing up. I think one leads to the other, and just something to think about. I want to make sure I give 30 seconds to each panelist to wrap up with any final words or thoughts or wisdom. So 30 seconds for each person. I'm going to start with Philip and work my way through. Any final thoughts, words you want to share on this topic?
Something we haven't talked much about, I could use a few seconds to highlight. is how important it is, and even more so now than ever, that we see schools as places that are identity safe. That is where the diversity that we find in our schools, whether it be cultural or gender related, that kids know that they can be accepted for who they are, that can be understood and supported in their identity development. And the social emotional skills in the school culture should all support that developmental path. And then we have an institution as a school that's serving the community and will eventually lead to I think a better society for us all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Sean, final words of wisdom.
Just that the way that I see social emotional learning is the aim is to infuse and embed it across the culture of the school. And so starting off with a program is a great way to start off, and it may be something you want to continue, but if it remains as a program done once a week in a certain section for a certain year level, then it's not achieving its aims. The aim is eventually to have positive social emotional learning occurring no matter where and no matter when across the whole school.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Kimberly.
Building relationships. I think that's my biggest thing that I can always say. And social emotional learning for me is really about building those relationships at all levels, giving those safe spaces, but not just for the students, but for the families and also for the staff at the school, and taking that ownership. I like what was said earlier about from the top down. So from the superintendent, board members into each school principal all the way down, the importance of building those relationships is really the biggest impact.
Thank you. And Pat, before I turn it back to Nidra, final thoughts.
Well, very well said from my colleagues today. It's encouraging to me to have such great champions for SEL, and that's what it takes, is to find champions for that will further in that integration of that into your climate and your culture. And I just want to say, due to our situation we're in now, the inequities in education have risen way above the top. Now is the time for us as educators to rethink education, and bringing SEL to the forefront and as foundational to that process, I think is key.
Okay, thank you. And I want to thank each and every one of you. I'm going to turn it back to Nidra at this point for any closing thoughts from Nasco. Thank you so much.
Thank you. As I reflect back on the last hour we spent here together, there are a lot of complex dimensions of SEL, right? How do we find the time in the day to do it? The parental engagement aspect, and there was a remark made. I think Pat, this was your example. SEL is the plate, and it occurred to me as you said that all of the other considerations of SEL flow from starting with a basic shared understanding of the role of SEL. And that's very transformative. If we think this isn't just one more course on the plate that we have to add, but it is literally the gateway through which all of the rest of the educational outcomes we're aspiring to deliver are augmented by creating that foundation. I think that's an extremely effective visual. And as we unite as a community around the understanding of the role of SEL, I think the answers, I'm not trying to say it will be easy, but the answers become, to the other questions, become more contextually relevant through that shared base of understanding. So mostly I want to thank all the attendees for caring about this, for helping champion this on the front lines. And I want to thank all of the panelists for being here today and sharing your experience and wisdom. I learned a lot myself today and really appreciate the insights and perspectives. Have a wonderful day, and the best to everybody.
Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.